In the gilded halls of the Habsburg palace, a young woman stared at her reflection in a mirror of polished silver, her jaw jutting forward in a grotesque underbite that had plagued her bloodline for centuries. Maria Theresa of Spain couldn't close her mouth properly, couldn't chew her food without pain, and when she tried to speak, her words came out slurred and broken. She was the product of an uncle marrying his niece, a nephew wedding his aunt, and generations of royals who believed their blood was too sacred to mix with common nobility. But Maria Theresa wasn't alone in her suffering. Across the palaces of Europe, royal women bore the physical and mental scars of a dangerous obsession with bloodline purity that turned family trees into twisted circles of genetic catastrophe. Their stories aren't just tales of physical deformity. They're haunting chronicles of women trapped between their royal duty and their human frailty, living proof that even kings and queens couldn't escape the merciless laws of nature. Picture Europe in the 15th century, a continent carved into kingdoms where bloodline meant everything, and a single drop of common blood could destroy a dynasty's legitimacy forever. In the marble corridors of Versailles, the stone halls of Vienna's Hofburg Palace, and the ancient towers of Spain's Royal Alcazar, a dangerous idea had taken root like poison ivy, wrapping around the pillars of power. Royal blood wasn't just noble, it was divine, touched by God himself, flowing with the essence of saints and Caesars. To dilute it with merchant blood or even lesser nobility was not just distasteful, it was sacrilege. And so, across the royal courts of Europe, family trees began to twist inward like arthritic fingers, grasping at their own branches. The Habsburgs perfected this dark art. For over 200 years, they practiced strategic inbreeding with the cold calculation of chess masters. Uncle married niece, first cousins exchanged wedding vows, brothers-in-law became fathers-in-law in Byzantine arrangements that would make even seasoned genealogists dizzy. They called it keeping the blood pure. History would call it something else entirely. In the Spanish court, Charles II's grandfather Philip III had married his own niece. Philip IV followed suit, wedding his brother's daughter. Each generation, the genetic net grew tighter, the family circle smaller, the consequences more severe. The royal physicians noticed it first. Children born with peculiar jaw formations, difficulties speaking, problems with fertility. But the court astrologers declared these were marks of divine favour, signs that God himself had blessed these bloodlines with sacred distinction. The women bore the heaviest burden. While male heirs could at least expect to rule despite their deformities, royal daughters were valued primarily as breeding stock, their worth measured by their ability to produce healthy heirs, while carrying the genetic time bombs planted by centuries of inbreeding. They were caught in an impossible trap, too royal to marry beneath their station, too genetically compromised to marry safely within it. In the Austrian branch of the Habsburg dynasty, Archduchess Maria Anna lived her entire life knowing she was destined to marry her uncle, a man 16 years her senior who shared too many of her genes. She spent her childhood in the shadow of this predetermined fate, watching as her own physical development bore the telltale signs of inbreeding. The characteristic Habsburg lip, the struggles with basic functions that should have come naturally. The courts themselves became theatres of elaborate denial. Portraits were carefully altered to minimize deformities. Court physicians developed euphemisms for genetic conditions, noble bearing for spinal deformities, aristocratic constitution for mental disabilities, royal sensitivity for epilepsy and seizures. The truth was hidden behind layers of silk and ceremony, but it couldn't be erased. By the 17th century, the practice had spread like a contagion through Europe's interconnected royal families. The Portuguese royal house, the French Bourbons, the English Stuarts, all began to show the characteristic signs of systematic inbreeding. Royal women became living experiments in genetic degradation, their bodies laboratories for testing just how far human DNA could be pushed before it broke entirely. The secret that European royalty guarded more fiercely than their crown jewels wasn't hidden treasure or political conspiracies. It was the systematic destruction of their own humanity, one carefully arranged marriage at a time. Behind closed doors, the reality was becoming impossible to ignore. Royal women were dying in childbirth at alarming rates. Those who survived often produced children so severely deformed that they were hidden away in remote wings of palaces, their existence erased from official records. The sin wasn't just the marriages themselves, it was the deliberate choice to continue this genetic Russian roulette generation after generation, even as the evidence mounted like bodies in a plague pit. Take Joanna of Castile, known to history as Joanna the Mad. Born in 1479 to Ferdinand and Isabella, themselves cousins, Joanna displayed signs of severe mental instability that only worsened after her marriage to Philip the Handsome of Burgundy. But here's what the history books rarely mention. Philip was also her cousin, and their union was another link in the chain of Habsburg inbreeding. When Philip died suddenly in 1506, Joanna's grip on reality shattered completely. She refused to allow his burial, carrying his coffin with her across Spain, opening it periodically to kiss his decomposing face. Court records, hidden for centuries, reveal that physicians at the time suspected her condition was hereditary, a direct result of the concentrated royal bloodlines. But Joanna's madness was just the beginning. Her daughter, Catherine of Austria, would marry her own uncle, King John III of Portugal. Their children bore the full weight of genetic catastrophe, severe intellectual disabilities, physical deformities so pronounced that foreign ambassadors wrote shocked letters home describing the monstrous appearance of Portuguese royal children. Catherine herself suffered from what court physicians called melancholic episodes, violent mood swings that left her catatonic for weeks at a time. The betrayal went deeper than individual marriages. Royal families began keeping two sets of genealogical records, public family trees that obscured the closest relationships, and private documents that tracked the true genetic connections with clinical precision. They knew exactly what they were doing. Spanish court archives, discovered in the 20th century, contain detailed medical observations from the 1600s documenting the increasing frequency of stillbirths, infant mortality, and developmental disorders among Habsburg children. Maria Anna of Austria, daughter of Emperor Ferdinand III, lived her entire life as a testament to this genetic betrayal. Born in 1634, she was promised in marriage to her uncle Philip IV of Spain when she was just 4 years old. The marriage contract was signed before she could even walk properly, which, as it turned out, she never fully learned to do. Maria Anna suffered from severe joint deformities that left her partially crippled, a condition that worsened throughout her childhood as her body tried to develop within the constraints of her compromised DNA. When she finally arrived in Spain at age 15 to marry her 48-year-old uncle, court observers noted with barely concealed horror her physical condition. The Venetian ambassador wrote in a secret dispatch, "The new queen walks with great difficulty and speaks with such impediment that even her closest attendants struggle to understand her words. Yet she carries herself with such dignity that one cannot help but feel the profound tragedy of her circumstances." But perhaps the most sinister aspect was how these women were gaslit by the very system destroying them. Court physicians told them their suffering was evidence of their spiritual purity, that their physical ailments were signs of divine favour. Religious advisors convinced them that their duty to produce heirs transcended personal comfort or even basic health. Maria Anna miscarried 7 times before finally producing a daughter who lived only 4 years. Each loss was explained away as God's will, never as the inevitable consequence of genetic catastrophe. The Portuguese royal family took this betrayal to its logical extreme. Queen Maria the Am, born in 1734, was the product of an uncle-niece marriage, and was herself married to her own uncle, Peter III. Their genetic coefficient of inbreeding was so extreme that modern geneticists calculate their children had the genetic diversity equivalent to the offspring of siblings. Maria Theresa's descent into madness began, slowly, periods of melancholy that gradually transformed into violent psychotic episodes. By 1792, she was completely incapacitated, spending her days screaming that she was damned to hell, convinced that the physical deformities of her children were divine punishment for her bloodline's sins. The most damning evidence of intentional betrayal came from the private correspondence of Empress Maria Theresa of Austria, not the Spanish one from our opening, but her Austrian contemporary. In letters to her daughter, Marie Antoinette, she wrote with chilling pragmatism about the necessity of continuing inbreeding practices, despite their unfortunate consequences. She acknowledged that royal women were suffering and dying, but argued that maintaining dynastic purity was worth the sacrifice. These weren't ignorant decisions. They were calculated choices made by people who fully understood the human cost. By the 18th century, the genetic chickens had come home to roost with a vengeance that would have impressed the Greek tragedians. The royal bloodlines of Europe hadn't just been weakened, they had been systematically poisoned from within, and the women who bore the brunt of this catastrophe became living monuments to human hubris. Maria Theresa of Spain, the woman from our opening scene, represented the absolute nadir of Habsburg genetic collapse. Born in 1638 to Philip IV and his niece-wife Mariana of Austria, she embodied 4 generations of concentrated inbreeding in a single tortured body. Her famous Habsburg jaw was so pronounced that she couldn't close her mouth, leading to constant drooling and slurred speech that made her the subject of cruel court gossip. But her physical deformities were only the visible symptoms of a deeper genetic catastrophe. Foreign ambassadors' reports from the Spanish court paint a picture of almost unbearable tragedy. The French envoy wrote that Maria Theresa suffers from such violent convulsions that her attendants must restrain her to prevent injury to herself. Her mental faculties are so compromised that she cannot maintain a conversation for more than a few moments without becoming confused and distressed. Yet she was still considered a suitable bride for Louis XIV of France in a marriage that would produce 6 children, only one of whom survived to adulthood. But Maria Theresa's story pales compared to that of Margarita Theresa of Spain, her half-sister, and perhaps the most genetically compromised royal woman in European history. Born in 1651 to Philip IV and Mariana of Austria, the same union that produced Maria Theresa, Margarita's family tree reads like a genetic nightmare. Her parents were uncle and niece, her maternal grandparents were first cousins, her paternal grandparents were also first cousins. The mathematical probability of genetic disaster wasn't just high, it was virtually guaranteed. Margarita was promised in marriage to her own uncle, Emperor Leopold I of Austria, when she was just 3 years old. Court portraits from her childhood, preserved in Vienna's imperial archives, show a child whose physical development was already severely compromised. By age 8, she required a specially designed chair to support her malformed spine. By 12, she needed assistance walking. Her wedding to Leopold, a man who was simultaneously her uncle, her first cousin once removed and her second cousin, took place in 1666 when she was 15, though she had the physical and mental development of a much younger child. The aftermath of their union was swift and brutal. Margarita became pregnant almost immediately but miscarried within months. This pattern repeated itself with devastating consistency. Pregnancy, brief hope, inevitable loss. Court records detail 6 pregnancies in 4 years, with only 1 child surviving infancy. That daughter, Maria Antonia, lived just 7 years before, succumbing to what physicians described as inherited weakness of constitution. Margarita herself began to deteriorate rapidly after each failed pregnancy. Spanish ambassadors reported that she suffered from seizures so violent that they left her unconscious for hours. Her speech became increasingly unintelligible, and by age 20 she required constant medical care. The young empress, who had once been considered a political prize, became a tragic figure, wheeled through the halls of the Hofburg Palace in a chair designed for an invalid, her eyes vacant and her body failing in ways that defied contemporary medical understanding. The final tragedy came in 1673 when Margarita, at just 22, died during another difficult pregnancy. Her death marked not just the end of an individual life, but the collapse of an entire genetic line. Leopold, devastated by the loss, would later write in his private journal, "God has punished our house for the sin of believing ourselves above his natural laws." Perhaps even more heartbreaking was the story of Elizabeth Christine of Brunswick-Wolfenbüttel, who married into the Habsburg line in 1708. Unlike her predecessors, Elizabeth Christine came from relatively healthy Germanic nobility. She should have been a genetic lifeline for the dying dynasty. But by then, the Habsburg genetic load was so concentrated that even an infusion of fresh blood couldn't save their children. Elizabeth Christine bore 3 children to Emperor Charles VI, himself the product of multiple generations of inbreeding. 2 died in infancy from what court physicians called failure to thrive, a euphemism for genetic conditions so severe that the children simply couldn't sustain life. The 3rd child, Maria Theresa, not to be confused with her Spanish namesake, survived but struggled with fertility issues throughout her life, managing to produce only 1 son who lived to adulthood. But Elizabeth Christine's real tragedy was watching her husband's slow descent into genetic madness. Charles VI, despite surviving childhood, gradually developed severe mental instability and obsessive-compulsive behaviours so extreme that he required handlers to manage his daily routines. Elizabeth Christine spent 30 years married to a man whose mind deteriorated steadily, leaving her to rule as an unofficial regent while maintaining the public facade that her husband was mentally competent. The Portuguese royal family reached their own genetic dead end with Queen Maria Theresa, whose complete mental breakdown in the 1790s marked the effective end of Portuguese royal inbreeding experiments. After decades of violent psychotic episodes, Maria spent her final years in a state of catatonic depression, convinced that she was already dead and burning in hell. Her son, the future King John VI, was so traumatized by witnessing his mother's condition that he refused to marry within the royal family, effectively ending Portugal's participation in the European inbreeding network. By the early 1800s, the evidence was undeniable. Royal women across Europe were dying young, producing children with severe disabilities, and suffering from mental conditions that no amount of royal privilege could cure. The bloodlines that had once been considered touched by God were revealed to be cursed by their own genetic hubris. The fall wasn't just individual, it was dynastic. The Spanish Habsburg line died out completely with Charles II in 1700. The Portuguese royal family fled to Brazil to escape the genetic demons of their European heritage. The Austrian Habsburgs survived only by finally opening their marriage practices to distant relatives and foreign nobility, diluting the concentrated poison that had accumulated in their DNA. Standing in the portrait galleries of Europe's great palaces today, visitors gaze upon hundreds of paintings of royal women whose stories have been sanitized by time and tradition. The plaques beneath their gilded frames speak of marriages, alliances, and diplomatic triumphs. They don't mention the seizures, the stillbirths, the slow descent into madness, or the genetic time bombs these women carried in their cells. But perhaps the most haunting question isn't about what happened to these women, it's about what their suffering reveals about the nature of power itself. These weren't ignorant medieval peasants making decisions based on superstition. These were the most educated, wealthy, and informed people of their time. They had access to the best physicians, the most advanced medical knowledge available, and detailed genealogical records that clearly showed the patterns of genetic degradation. They saw their own children suffering and dying. They witnessed their daughters' agonizing pregnancies and sons' mental deterioration. And yet, generation after generation, they chose to continue. The royal women we've encountered, Maria Theresa with her protruding jaw, Margarita Theresa dying at 22, Elizabeth Christine watching her husband lose his mind, weren't just victims of genetic chance. They were sacrifices offered to the altar of an idea so powerful that it overrode the most basic human instincts for survival and protection of offspring. Consider the mathematics of their situation. By the 17th century, some Habsburg marriages had inbreeding coefficients higher than those found in modern laboratory mouse populations, animals specifically bred for genetic uniformity in scientific experiments. The royal families of Europe had turned their own bloodlines into genetic laboratories, and the women were the primary test subjects. Modern geneticists studying the Habsburg pedigrees have calculated that by the time of Charles II of Spain, the last of the Spanish Habsburg line, his genetic diversity was lower than that of children born to immediate siblings. His death in 1700, childless and mentally incapacitated, marked not just the end of a dynasty but the conclusion of one of history's most systematic genetic experiments on human beings. But here's what makes their story truly chilling. It worked, at least politically. The Habsburg network of intermarriage created the largest empire in European history. Their genetic sacrifice purchased political dominance that lasted for centuries. The women who suffered and died in the process weren't failures. They were successful tools in a calculated strategy that prioritized power over human welfare. In the private letters of these royal women, when they're honest about their situation, a pattern emerges. They understood their role. Maria Anna of Austria, writing to her sister before her marriage to Philip IV, penned words that still echo across the centuries. "I know what is required of me, and I will do my duty, though it cost me my health, my happiness, and perhaps my life. This is what it means to be born royal, to sacrifice everything human within us for the sake of something greater than ourselves." The question that haunts modern historians isn't whether these women were victims. They clearly were. The question is whether their sacrifice was worth it, and what that calculation reveals about the societies that made it. Today, we look back at these stories with horror, seeing clear evidence of systematic abuse disguised as noble duty. We recognise the genetic principles that these royal families violated with such devastating consequences. We understand that their physical and mental suffering was entirely preventable, the result of human choices rather than divine will or natural disaster. But we also live in a world shaped by the empires their suffering helped create. The political boundaries of modern Europe, the cultural traditions we've inherited, even the languages we speak were all influenced by the Habsburg network that consumed these women's lives. Their genetic sacrifice didn't just purchase temporary political advantage, it helped forge the foundations of the modern world. Standing before those palace portraits today, visitors might ask themselves, if they had been born into that system, surrounded by centuries of tradition and the weight of dynastic expectation, would they have made different choices? Would they have been willing to sacrifice their family's genetic future for political power? Would they have had the courage to break the cycle, knowing it might mean the collapse of everything their ancestors had built? The royal women of Europe's inbreeding experiments took these questions to their graves. They lived and died within a system that treated their bodies as political instruments and their suffering as acceptable collateral damage in the pursuit of power. Their stories aren't just historical curiosities, they're warnings about what happens when human beings become tools in service of abstract ideals, when the pursuit of purity becomes more important than the preservation of humanity. In the end, the most unanswered question might be this: how many Maria Theresas? How many Margarita Theresas? How many Elizabeth Christines would we be willing to sacrifice today for our own versions of political purity or ideological perfection? The palaces may be museums now, but the human capacity for transforming people into symbols, individuals into instruments, remains as dangerous as ever. The curse of keeping bloodlines pure wasn't just genetic, it was moral. And that curse, unlike the Habsburg jaw or the Portuguese madness, has never been fully broken. It simply finds new forms, new justifications, new victims in every generation that believes its cause is pure enough, important enough, sacred enough to require human sacrifice. The royal women whose stories we've told tonight understood this truth in their bones, felt it in their failing bodies, carried it in their compromised DNA. They were the price paid for purity, the human cost of an inhuman ideal. Their portraits hang in those palace galleries not as monuments to nobility, but as warnings, eternal reminders that when we pursue perfection at the expense of humanity, we don't become gods, we become monsters.